for the Alt Knowledge's student-led exhibition series. This is part of the Fall Graphic Design Exhibition Design Advanced Studio Elective. And my name is Chris Hamamoto. I teach in graphic design at California College of the Arts. As we begin this afternoon, I want to acknowledge that CCA campuses are located in Huichin and Yelamu, also known as Oakland and San Francisco, on the unceded territories of Chochenyo and Ramaitish Ohlone peoples. And I'd also like to recognize that you are joining us from many places today, near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. And this series of solo exhibitions explores alternative values through the work of Amy Suo Wu, Danielle Aubert, and Hardworking Goodlooking, presenting models to challenge entrenched colonial and capitalist systems through privacy tactics, worker-run presses, and a rethinking of modernist design values. And we're so lucky to be joined here today by Danielle, who will give a presentation on her work after the students share a short preview of the exhibitions. And I think I see Zar and Christian here from Hardworking Goodlooking. So thank you so much for coming today. It's great to see you. And just for a little bit of context, we were planning to host a live stream of a physical iteration of these exhibitions from the If Then studio space in Berkeley, California. However, the Bay Area is on lockdown right now with a stay-at-home order. So we decided to pause that physical install until the order gets lifted. So tonight it will be a mix of exhibition previews and more dispersed works that will be activated in the coming weeks in various fashions. And once the order is lifted, we'll finish our install and reschedule a live stream for those who are interested. And I swear I'm almost done with this intro. After the students present their projects, they'll intro Danielle and we'll end with some questions. So if you at any time have a question, just feel free to put it in the chat and we'll try and make sure to get to it. And lastly, this event is part of and has been made possible by a grant from CCA's Creative Citizens in Action initiative, which supports CCA programming that connects art, activism, and social justice, democratic engagement, and current events. So yeah, thank you so much again, and I'm gonna hand it over to Darian.
Thank you. So we're going to talk about our exhibition titled Number 7, If You Don't Like It, Make Your Own. So this semester we worked with Danielle, who we will talk more about later, but something that we discovered when working with Danielle and in our early conversations with her is that a lot of her work focuses on themes of labor and methods of production and also reproduction. So those were kind of the first themes that stood out really strong to us and that we wanted to kind of play with throughout this. So through having discussions with Danielle and looking at her work and research from Freddie Perlman and the Detroit Printing Co-op, something that really stood out to us was a zine called Black and Red. And I'll read a quick excerpt from Freddie about this zine. Black and Red is not a new current of radical thought within capitalist society. Black and Red is a subversive action. It is a new front in the world anti-capitalist society. It is an organic link between theory action of the world revolutionary movement and the action theory new front. And when looking at this work, it just seemed really relevant today, talking about some of the social and political issues that were going on at that time. We're seeing mirrored again now. And this was something that Freddie also worked on with his wife and students at Western Michigan University. So for us to be students and dealing with these same issues, it felt really kind of apt to work with this. So we wanted to display some work from Black and Red as part of our exhibition. So these are some prints from Black and Red. And as you can see here, speech bubbles were a really common theme in the zine. And that's something that you'll see come up again throughout our work. And then to talk a little bit about the title, Number 7, If You Don't Like It, Make Your Own. The last issue of Black and Red was number 6.5. So we wanted to play with the idea of kind of picking it up where it left off. And then If You Don't Like It, Make Your Own comes directly from one of the issues. And we thought that it felt really appropriate since we're going to be sending an exhibition kit rather than a formal kind of like gallery exhibit. So this idea that you can kind of reimagine what an exhibit looks like. And we wanted to have these kind of subtle things that would play to the idea of make your own within the identity. So seeing on the left, we have the speech bubbles, and then on the right, we have the empty speech bubbles, kind of leaving this space for people to make their own interpretation. So this is our brochure from the kit. Again, playing with that same idea, rather than getting a like nice kind of like bound or saddle stitch brochure, you actually get these pieces that you have to put together. And there's also blank pages that you can use to kind of fill in and talk about the exhibit that you created. And then in the kit, there are 5 Riso prints that come from Black and Red, Sharpies, glue, and there's a custom tape. And we really want the people who receive this to kind of challenge what an exhibition has to look like. You don't have to just kind of like take things and pin them up. Feel free to like collage them, rip them, write on them, and just really reimagine what this can look like. And here's the box in its total form. So this is what is received. And of course, this is something that came out of COVID and working in these more remote conditions. But it all felt really appropriate once we started digging into it. So it's one of those things that fits the times and also really fits the content as well. So it's really great to find this harmony. And then just some more detailed shots of what is received. Like I mentioned, we did order a custom tape to kind of secure the box, but also still have it feel really connected to the project. Thank you.
Cool, thank you, Darian. And in just a second, I'm going to share my screen and Lee will present on the show from with Hardworking Goodlooking. So I'm gonna share this. Can everybody see my screen? Okay, yeah. Great.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Chris. And hi, everyone. We're CCA Hardworking Goodlooking group, and we work together the LFA tabletop exhibition and also the designer show. And the Hardworking Goodlooking is a performative publishing house established in 2013, led by Clara and Kristen. Most of their work created by Hardworking Goodlooking and published out of the Philippines, but hammers are all around the world, and they create prints and displays cultural publication in interest like decolonization of cultural labor and the value of what has been invisible. The next page. The Hardworking Goodlooking showcase the design, decision, and practice rooted in the local Philippine and supports contemporary guerrilla digital activism. And they focus on challenging the orthodoxy and modernist canon in design, preserving the unedited, layered, and quotation mark with ugly design. Preference unique to the Philippine culture, and they also offers workshop and hangouts for print, sharing books, and conversing learning environment parallel to a school. And their major works including the Colombo Bulletin on the left and relearning in the middle, and the Philippine Folk Foundry, the FFF on the right. And yeah, this is our mission statement. The Unfaithful Kami exhibition is designed to impart aspect of undocumented history of graphic design in Philippines, and dissemination is the focus of our exhibition, hoping to reach larger audience and unprivileged artists. Yeah, and this is the Colombo Bulletin pages, And this is the unrelearning photos. And this is FFF, the Filipino Folk Foundry. And yeah, for the curation, our exhibition displays selected pages from colonial bulletin work by Hardworking Goodlooking and slideshow of a resource from Unrelearning Online Library, and images representing concept of collaboration and sharing from Hardworking Goodlooking workshops. And we hope to reach large audience through our promotion through Instagram. We will be live streaming a video documentation of the exhibition, as well as post selections of the display on Instagram. This way, the show will exist both physically and online. So the show will be promoted in different locations around the world, where each of us are located: San Jose, San Francisco, Michigan, and China. And the graphics language reflect to the hardworking, good-looking, as well as the curating. They many times use the projector and workshops. And yeah, thank you.
Cool, thank you, Lee. And then Menaja, are you able to share your screen?
I was wondering if you could share it.
Okay, sure. No problem. I'm just gonna present it. It'll just take me 1 sec.
Thank you.
No worries. Okay. So I think hopefully everybody can see a gray screen.
So my team worked with the artist Amy Suo Wu, and our exhibition is called Turn on the Invisible Layers, which exhibits four pieces of hers. And it was a really amazing experience for all of us to be able to work with her, since she's actually an artist of Chinese descent who was born and brought up in Australia, but now works and lives in the Netherlands. So even for us as artists, we're all Asian artists and we're all like based in the States now. For us to be able to draw from her experience as a really like with the multicultural background and how that translates into her work was a really amazing experience for all of us. And her work basically deals with steganography and cryptography, which deals with like a lot of like secret messages and decoding and creating layers within her work, where there are messages hidden within things that are either overt or like more open or more hidden. And her work deals with a lot of that. So we really wanted to explore the idea of layers and the idea of invisibility and visibility and what we allow others to see through her work. So the exhibition lives as one of its forms is a website, which is visible here, where the entire, the body of work which we're showing is all curated and it's shown over here along with the information for it. And then we also produce physical pieces, which are going to be installed in the space, in the gallery space eventually. So for the works from Thunderclap, which was one of our exhibitions, we printed t-shirts, and we wanted to play with that idea of layering. So we overprinted images on top of each other on the t-shirts. And the crux of this exhibition for her was hiding a lot of secret messages into clothing and into textiles and garments, which people would wear around. So it was a really alternative form of having an exhibition, which we thought was really appropriate to show over here. So this is one of the pieces that we have. And then this is another piece of hers, which was the media archaeology of steganography, where again we wanted to play with an alternative form of creating layers. So we took the entire image and broke it up and then printed it onto the canvas, which is going to be, so again, it doesn't show the entire image, but it really urges the audience or the person who's looking at it to like dig deeper to try and get the meaning of the piece. And then this was another book of hers that we reprinted called The Choice of a Translator. And again, this piece deals with the idea of language and like meaning that is coded within language. And we printed this as a accordion book, which is going to be shown. And finally, for the mission statement, we also wanted to like have a lot of fun with it since this wasn't one of her pieces, but we again played with the idea of layers where we printed the mission statement onto one really large piece of paper. Well, we tile printed it and then we pasted posters of the exhibition on top of it. And then we ripped the parts of the posters off so that the mission statement underneath it would be visible. And again, it speaks to the visual language that we were employing throughout our entire system for the exhibition, where we were using a glyph character set that Amy herself had designed, and the name of the exhibition is written in those glyphs. And with like some of the postcards that we've printed for the show, it works as a key that you can use to decode these messages. And here's just some documentation of the process of ripping the posters. So it's very interactive as well. And we had initially hoped that it would be such that people who were coming to see the exhibition themselves could rip parts of the posters off, but obviously with the situation we're in right now, that's not going to be possible. So, but we have it, like it's like ripped already, like we did it ourselves, and it's going to be shown. And this is like another element of the exhibition, which was the typeface that Amy had used, that one of our teammates had created into like coded into like a digital format. So the exhibition also lives as a typeface in a sense. Yeah.
Thank you, Manaja. Yeah, and thank you so much, everybody, for sharing. And again, once the lockdown is lifted, we'll have the install at IFSEN. So we hope you can join us for a live stream at that point. And I'm going to hand it over to, I think, Karina to introduce Danielle.
Yeah. Can I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Okay, so we're super excited to introduce Danielle. So just a little bit of a background. Danielle Aubert is a graphic designer, author, and educator whose work examines materials, methods of production, machines, and labor. She holds a BA in English literature from the University of Virginia and an MFA in graphic design from Yale University. Danielle is the author of several books, including Marketing the Dispossessed and the Detroit Printing Co-op, The Politics and Joy of Printing. Danielle has exhibited work in various venues, including the School of Art Institute in Chicago, the Palais de Tokyo in Paris, and Maro in Berlin. She currently resides in Detroit, Michigan, is an associate professor of graphic design at Wayne State University. And thank you so much, Danielle, for coming. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you. That's really nice intro. And also I'm excited about your group's project. I think it would be nice if you have an extra one. I can give one to Lorraine Perlman, who's from the co-op. I think she would be really into it.
Yes, we do have one for you.
Whoa. Okay, so I'll share. Okay. Yeah, so I'm gonna talk about the Detroit Printing Co-op today, which, yeah, so I'm gonna sort of which I've been working on for some time. So some people here might have heard some of this before, I don't know, but hopefully it's sort of new enough. But so, okay. Yeah, so, okay, so in 1969, Freddie Perlman wrote a pamphlet called The Reproduction of Daily Life. Freddie and his wife, Lorraine Perlman, would print thousands of copies of The Reproduction of Daily Life, first through a collective called the Community Print Shop and later at the Detroit Printing Co-op. They distributed the pamphlets primarily through the mail, through their publishing house, Black and Red. Other groups have translated this text into French, Portuguese, and Swedish. The Reproduction of Daily Life is Freddie Perlman's reading of Marx's theory of commodity fetishism. He describes the process by which those of us who live in a capitalist society reproduce the conditions that tether us to a life of selling our living activity for wages. We use wages to buy commodities and access to what he calls spectacles, which we experience as passive observers. He says we're consumed by things and we're unable or unwilling to act to change things. This produces in us what he calls a death in life. The problem of overcoming passivity is one that Perlman would return to again and again in other texts and in a way in his life. As he was writing The Reproduction of Daily Life, Freddie Perlman was engaged in publishing early issues of Black and Red, a magazine that he and Lorraine produced with comrades in Kalamazoo, Michigan. He recognized through this work the inherent labor of printing, but he also sought to reframe that labor as non-alienating. He wrote, quote, "Digging, printing, and carving are different activities, but all three are labor in a capitalist society. Labor is simply earning money. Living activity, which takes the form of labor, is a means to earn money. Life becomes a means of survival." One could argue that in a way, Freddie Perlman's life project was to figure out how to break out of this cycle, how to exit the reproduction of daily life. Perlman aimed to make printing something other than a means of survival, something other than a way to make money. In order to do that, he saw printing as a craft. And then this is sort of like a term that ends up kind of becoming important for him, I think. So each pamphlet that was printed at the Detroit Printing Co-op had political weight, not only in the content that it had, but also in the fact that it was made without wage labor. It was made by people who had the will to bring it into existence, but who were not compelled by wages. Freddie and Lorraine Perlman created the conditions for this kind of work by setting up the Detroit Printing Co-op, which existed from 1970 to 1980. In the years leading up to the start of the co-op, Freddie had been in Paris during the May 1968 student worker uprisings. He then later wrote this pamphlet on the left with Roger Gregoire. He had also had a 2-year position at Western Michigan University, which was long enough for him to become deeply cynical of academia. And he wrote this text on the right, "I accuse this liberal university of terror and violence," and that is an image of Western Michigan University in the background. In late 1969, Freddie, Lorraine, and their friends found space in Detroit and borrowed money in order to buy an old offset press, darkroom materials, and other machines and supplies necessary for setting up a proper print shop. They immediately began printing, publishing, and distributing leftist books, pamphlets, and posters. The co-op drew a wide range of people from across the city, most involved in movement politics. Some of the publications printed over the course of the 1970s include the first English translation of Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle, the Black Star publication, The Political Thought of James Forman, a poetry magazine called River Run, 6 years worth of issues of Radical America, which was the journal of SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, Rebel's Voice, which was an unofficial newspaper run by high school students in Detroit. All the books published by Black and Red Press between 1970 and 1980 were printed at the co-op. And so Freddie and Lorraine ended up starting a publishing house called also Black and Red, which was the name of their zine. At the co-op, the acts of writing about and debating politics were folded into the activities of page layout, typesetting, printing, binding, and trimming. Insofar as it might be possible to conceive of a leftist approach to graphic design, the work that came out of the Detroit Printing Co-op in the 1970s could be said to embody that ethos. They printed this union bug on all of their materials. Most of the users of the co-op had joined the IWW, which is the Industrial Workers of the World, a radical union dedicated to direct action, workplace democracy, and industrial unionism. They refused to engage in wage labor. And in fact, that's a precondition of joining the IWW. You cannot be a boss of anybody. So they refused to hire anyone to clean or do bookkeeping or any other kind of menial tasks around the print shop. Freddie and Lorraine, not that they even would have had money to do that in the first place, but Freddie and Lorraine did all the stages of production, often writing or translating texts, editing, laying out pages, physically printing the pages, binding, trimming, packaging, shipping, and distributing materials. They also came up with a set of guidelines for the co-op. The equipment was deemed social property. So one of the first statements, the first statement is that the equipment of the printing co-op is social property. It is and shall be controlled by all individuals who need, use, and maintain it. It is not and shall not be owned or controlled by any individual or group of individuals, whether they claim to serve, represent, or speak for society, whether they are elected or self-appointed. And this was partly in reference or in response to efforts by like political groups to kind of tell them, like leftist political groups that would be like, we're the Maoist revolutionaries, like you should, the co-op should actually be like the printing arm of our political organization. Like they didn't want anything to do with that. They always wanted to be kind of independent and didn't trust anyone, you know, that sort of claimed to speak for others. Freddie Perlman wrote The Reproduction of Daily Life before opening the co-op, but most of the copies were printed there at the co-op. For Perlman, committing to the project of running the Detroit Printing Co-op represented a big break. The act of leaving a comfortable job in academia to print, publish, and distribute texts, to creatively produce tangible objects, was itself an attempt to take active control of his own life and shift out of the mode of selling his labor for wages. However, he recognized the limitation of this. He wrote in here, quote, "An individual can surmount death in life through marginal creative activity, but the population cannot, except by abolishing the capitalist form of practical activity, by abolishing wage labor, and thus de-alienating creative activity." So Freddie Perlman here kind of acknowledges that in order for large-scale system change to take place, it would require more than a person here or there in engaging in anti-capitalist creative production. There are 2 editions of The Reproduction of Daily Life, and the most obvious visual difference between the 2 is that the photograph on the cover changes. So these 3 are all the first edition, and then this is the second edition. So in the second edition, this is clearly like the inside of a car factory, but in the first edition, it looks like the interior of a textile mill. And even though this is all first edition, there's 3 different type treatments for the text on the cover. The production quality is a little rough. The image on the cover doesn't fully bleed off the page in any of these examples, and the pamphlets are not face trimmed. One effect is that we, as readers, are aware of the labor and craft that went into the production of these pamphlets. Notably, the craft is not that great. Another Detroit printer that that's still practicing today that I know, I spoke to him about the Detroit Printing Co-op because he was printing also at that time in the 70s, and he referred to them as dilettantes who didn't really know how to print properly. But that said, Freddie Perlman was fascinated with craft. Lorraine Perlman said that in the early years of the co-op, as they were learning to use the equipment, quote, "Freddie was exhilarated by all aspects of the new activity. He frequently asserted that never before had he felt so intellectually stimulated as he was by the challenges and gratifications he found in mastering the graphic arts equipment and technique." Around the same time as he wrote The Reproduction of Daily Life, Freddie also wrote The Incoherence of the Intellectual, which is a comprehensive review of the writings of sociologist C. Wright Mills, who was a professor at Columbia. And it's hard to tell here, but this is the title of the book, and then it's overlaid on top of a portrait of C. Wright Mills. Mills wrote influential leftist books and articles in the late 1940s and 1950s, including The Power Elite and White Collar, at a time when political activity on the left in the US was at a low point following the McCarthy years. Mills's writing was influential to rising leftist intellectuals in the 1960s. Freddie Perlman met Mills when he was a graduate student at Columbia in 1956. And Lorraine said that Mills appealed to Freddie because, unlike other liberal professors, Mills expressed open outrage and frustration with the conditions of everyday life. So Freddie Perlman saw him as more kind of radical. He wasn't like a kind of liberal who would kind of say that they had issues with what's going on, but then would then like accept the status quo. A decade after meeting C. Wright Mills, Perlman had become a professor himself at Western Michigan University. He was deeply frustrated with academia, and he wrote The Incoherence of the Intellectual shortly after leaving his position at Western Michigan. Perlman makes 3 key points that emerge in this text. First, intellectual distance from laborers leads academics to passivity and inaction. Second, people create and uphold institutions through their own daily activity. And third, there is liberatory potential in what Mills and Perlman both call craftsmanship, which is characterized by what they call a unity of design, production, and enjoyment. The Incoherence of the Intellectual is both a political treatise and a beautifully crafted object. It's impossible not to take note of Perlman's inventive use of color and type. At that moment when Perlman was writing, laying out, and printing this book, he himself was in search of a kind of political and intellectual coherence in his own life. His decisions could be seen in contrast to Mills, who was an intellectual who stayed at Columbia. He stayed in the academy, writing books and articles that, for Perlman, were in direct contradiction to his lived existence. For Perlman, moving to Detroit at the end of 1969 to set up the co-op was a way to escape the death in life that threatened to stifle his existence. The 1967 Detroit Rebellion and the 1968 general strike in Paris were fresh events. It felt like there was revolutionary potential in the world. And by going to Detroit, he was sort of taking action, taking advantage of that possibility. So although Perlman was critical of C. Wright Mills, he was still very interested in the way that Mills wrote about craftsmanship as a potentially non-alienating practice. Mills describes this craftsman-like style of life in contrast with one in which people's lives are split between work and leisure. He writes that what he calls a person's true interest is too often relegated to a hobby rather than being central in their life. But for a person who's living a craftsman-like style of life, the, quote, unity of design, production, and enjoyment is the very root of free human development. For Mills and Perlman, the freedom of the craftsperson lies in their ability to work according to their own plan, to set up the conditions within which they will work, to determine what it is they will do, and to do that. As Mills writes, the continual joining of plan and performance brings even more firmly together the consummation of work and its instrumental activities, infusing the latter with the joy of the former. Since he works freely, the craftsman is able to learn from his work, to develop as well as use his capacities. In the case of the professional designer or like the graphic designer, Mills would have argued that that unity is ruptured. The activities of design, production, and enjoyment are split. And as Perlman puts it, that individual then loses coherence. So in other words, it means that like, if you're kind of living a craftspersonly way of life, you can get up, decide what you're gonna work on that day, work on it, and respond to the thing as you're doing it, like respond to the materials or like change your mind about what you're doing, and then kind of like, and it's all kind of part of your, it's all your will or your choice. And then that produces a kind of a coherence. But when you can't make those decisions, so let's say you're a professional graphic designer and you're working for a client on a deadline, like you're not making that choice necessarily to get up and do what it is you're doing, it causes you to lose coherence, they would argue. And then furthermore, this rupture produces a space for mass culture to fill it with what Perlman calls frenzy and trash and fraud. Not only is the rupture damaging to the designer as a person, but it is damaging to culture more broadly. So this for me also like kind of brings to mind, you know, you're supposed to work on this thing for your job, whatever. You don't really want to do it. So instead you like watch reality TV for 8 hours straight, or you like, you know, you kind of avoid the thing you're supposed to do. And then it kind of creates these spaces where there's like this like lack of this rupture that gets filled with kind of, you know, trash, quote unquote. So this is all, arguable or whatever. But so whereas C. Wright Mills didn't claim openly to be a Marxist, as far as I know, because he was writing right after this period of McCarthyism when, Marxists were like persecuted. Perlman uses openly Marxist terminology when he's writing about Mills, and he talks about the alienation of the laborer, which is like a Marxist term. So he would use this term, and he would talk about the alienation of the laborer to describe this rupture that Mills is talking about humans who alienate themselves in roles instead of creating their own lives. So Perlman, at that moment when he was writing The Incoherence of the Intellectual, was especially engaged with figuring out how to combine images and text, how to mix colors, and how to experiment with typography. This was one of the more complex printing projects he undertook. And so here he's like, these are just a couple of like details from the book, but like this is kind of a classic example where he would kind of mix colors and then combine images. There would not be like captions, so you didn't necessarily know what it is, but like the top image on the left, you have like a nuclear cloud, like a cloud from a nuclear bomb, and then you have like Einstein, and then an atomic bomb, and those kind of like make you invite the reader or the viewer to kind of like draw conclusions or make connections. On the bottom, there's like politicians, or there's like I don't recognize who the people are, but there's like some kind of a army general and like a statesman person on the left, and then some politicians in the middle, and then the image on the right is this sort of famous image from the Korean War of a girl with her brother, carrying her brother, who's like a refugee due to the war, and she's in front of an American tank. And by kind of juxtaposing these images, it like makes you kind of pull connections, and then these would be kind of placed inside the text, inside and within the text. So this example up here on the left is like I had to kind of do reverse Google image search to kind of figure out what some of these images are, but this is two people working on a bomb. So this is like kind of like extreme example of people who are reproducing the kind of oppressive systems of everyday life through their job. Like they go to the job every day and make a bomb, which is like destructive. And then this guy, I cannot remember his name, but he is somebody who was key in like inventing the bomb or promoting the bomb. And he taught also like at Stanford. So I think it's sort of supposed to make this connection between academia and the like violence of US imperialist warfare and like kind of the US. And all of these images are somehow significant, that it's not always clear how. He also, so then Freddie Perlman also was sort of like, has his own idiosyncratic way of setting the type, which I think is also interesting. Like the main text is set in Times New Roman, but then whenever he's quoting C. Wright Mills, he switches to universe italic. And then whenever he quotes somebody else, he uses quotation marks. And in order to do this, he would have been switching out the typewriter balls on a typewriter. So like each time you wanted to switch fonts, you had to switch out a new ball. So for instance, on this bottom line, this is like universe italic, and then it switches to universe bold. And then this word it is Times New Roman, and then it goes back to universe italic. And then again, Times New Roman italic. So like each of those would require a shift. And which is time consuming, and it's like it's in a way you could say it's like a form of craft, but it's him kind of like responding to the material and responding to, let's say, the machines as he's working. So much of Freddie Perlman's experimental energy stemmed from the political and economic structure of the printing co-op itself. The decision not to work for wages or monetize his time. This concerted attempt to engage with craft, like the craft of printing, but not as like a wage laborer, led to design and printing decisions that would not be rational in a for-profit environment structured according to the rules of capitalism. He was demonstrating that you could be an intellectual and be an engaged worker and an agent of change. So over the years, the printing projects became a bit more sedate, like and kind of like less crazy. It was just, you know, regular, just one color for just regular books without that many images in them. Though there are certainly other examples of experimental printing, notably this book, The Manual for Revolutionary Leaders, which includes elaborate collages and a series of like for instance, this collage, and then like a sort of set of paragraphs where like each paragraph starts with this kind of elaborate drop cap. And this book is a satirical collection of quotations from revolutionary leaders from around the world who Freddie saw as people seeking to empower themselves. Lorraine, I should also say Freddie Perlman died in 1985. He was only 50 years old, and his wife Lorraine still lives in Michigan. And I talked to her a lot as I was doing this research. So Lorraine would later say that when Freddie heard people say all power to the people, Freddie heard all power to the leaders, and he was very like cynical about people's motivations for wanting to be leaders. So this, like these drop caps are like examples of quote unquote revolutionary leaders who he saw as like corrupted. So for instance, Mao or like Nehru, really nobody escapes his, you know, he's sort of wanted to discredit all these people. And then the book is also like rich with collages throughout. And I will say also, the whole thing is supposed to be a satire. So it's like quotes from these people, but then it actually ended up being popular with people. People kind of were buying it like for inspiration or whatever. So it was kind of like, it kind of had the opposite effect that they wanted it to. They were like frustrated by this somehow. But beside from, I feel like those two books are sort of the most visually kind of experimental books, but otherwise their books were kind of more plain. The most consistent users of the co-op over the years were Freddie and Lorraine Perlman, whose Black and Red publishing house was well known and respected on the left. They published many texts in translation that weren't otherwise available, but they nearly always included notes in their publications indicating that they were not interested in copywriting anything, and that those engaged in their production were doing it of their own free will. And then in response to an inquiry from another publisher who was writing to ask if they could reprint one of the books, one of the Black and Red books, Bolsheviks and Workers' Control, Freddie Perlman wrote this long reply, which kind of sums up their approach to intellectual and artistic ownership. And I'll just read what he wrote. He writes, "We like this book so well that we think that there should be 2, 3, many reprints of it. This does not only make the book more widely available, it also helps prevent anyone from establishing a monopoly over radical publications. We believe that such monopolies or embryonic state publishing houses of revolutionary literature do not make revolutionary literature available, but on the contrary, block the publication of revolutionary literature and impose official pseudo-revolutionary lines. We encourage our friends to typeset, print, and distribute the views they urgently want to express, and we discourage anyone from submitting their new and radical insights to any professor, publisher, university, or other intermediary who places himself between a writer and her or his reader. That's why we don't put any type of copyright in any of our books. That's why we're enchanted whenever anyone, anywhere reprints any of our publications or portions thereof. And although we don't request it of anyone in any form, we're pleased when we are given credit for work, sometimes a great deal of hard, albeit enjoyable work that we've done. We in turn don't like to take credit for work others have done." So just in conclusion, the co-op was connected internationally with radicals, printers, and publishers in England, France, and Canada, among other places. Collective projects that members engaged in were later shaped by the ideas that they read about in publications printed at the co-op and by the discussions and arguments they generated. Foremost among these was a desire to work cooperatively, to abolish the wage system, and to abolish the state. From the outset, the focus of the co-op was to be a productive space where people could print whatever they wanted, uncensored, without anyone's labor being exploited. Over the years, the co-op was the site of countless forms of collective work, with groups forming and reforming, people jumping in to work on one project or another, coming to work on their own, or joining on a larger project. Typesetting and printing were often a truly collective experience involving 6 or 7 people in a room, working, eating, drinking, arguing, and laughing. But by the end of the 1970s, the printing industry overall was already beginning to decline and print shops were closing. Publishers were no longer censoring content the way they were at the beginning of the decade. Freddie and Lorraine Perlman were often the only ones using the equipment. At the end of 1979, their landlord informed them of plans to sell the building. Unable to find anyone in Detroit who wanted to reopen the co-op in a new location, they decided to close. A group of young anarchists in Ann Arbor, Michigan took the offset press and other equipment ended up in the basements and workshops of friends and acquaintances. The Detroit Printing Co-op was an integral and unforgettable part of the left movement in the United States in the 70s that had a profound and kind of like larger effect, I think, in the like regionally and internationally. So that is all I have. Sorry, that was a lot of reading, but I had decided at one point I would write that all out, so I did. I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Do you mind if people have questions, if fielding some?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, if anybody has questions, please feel free just to, turn on your mic and say them, or put them in the chat, and I can read them too. I guess
I just want to say he's like my new hero.
Yeah. I know. I feel like it's like he was just like, fuck it. He just left his job and lived. I don't know really how he did it. Just did what he wanted.
When you were kind of sharing his story, one of the things that came to mind for me is that, given the fact that we're all kind of sequestered in our homes during COVID, and that like everybody obviously is like has some sort of relationship to social media, we're not in control of those platforms, and so the fact that he's kind of expressing the need to own the means of production as a way to feel and react to the material is something we don't necessarily have when we're kind of sharing our lives on social media platforms. We don't actually have control over how these things are used or where the data is going. And so I think there's an interesting correlation between how he's expressing that kind of lack of connection to, how you're creating stuff when you're thinking about how we just freely give our lives to these platforms that we don't have control over.
Yeah, no, and I've been thinking a lot about, I think one of the questions, because I've been working on this, or I've been, thinking about this for a while, but like one of the questions that often comes up is like how it relates to the present, or like how things are different from the present moment. But I think that the means of production is the sort of like one key thing, but also just I think in the last like few months I've been thinking more about this thing of craftsmanship, or like that not that I don't even know if that's a good term for it, but that idea of like the unity of plan, and like I think this is really true, like that you can feel it when you're in or when you're he's sort of talking about that moment of like you're in your own free will, you decide I'm gonna knit a sweater, and that's what you want to do that day, and you do that, versus like that kind of a project. The difference in engaging in that kind of project, or like baking, like everybody at the start of lockdown was all like baking. The difference between engaging in something like that versus something where it's like a job, or I don't know. But
it's like the craftsmanship is kind of related to using your hands, which we don't do as much, right?
Yeah.
So how rare are these books? Like, are they, how easily accessible are these to find? Are they super rare and expensive right now?
No, well, not really, but what's a good place is out near you all is Bellarium Books. If you know them, do you know Bellarium? I got a ton of stuff from them actually, because
I still need to make my way over there.
There's someone there who like worked with them, or there was somebody you know, the people who work in Bellarium are kind of amazing too. And so they know them too, or they know about who the Freddie Perlman is and stuff.
I just want to mention there's a question from the chat from Aisha that says, thank you, a lot to think on about. I'm curious how the co-op was funding their activities, operations, / materials.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So basically they borrowed money. I think they borrowed about $5,000 at the beginning to get all the equipment. And then they had monthly rent was their cost. And then they had the materials. So they actually made a bit of money selling publications, which is, you know, hard to think of for us to think about, because when, I think for, you know, for us, it's like, I think there's such a small, it's hard to make money off of books now, but then I think it was a little bit easier. So they sold a lot, they actually sold a pretty high volume, like that Society the Spectacle, they sold like thousands of copies of that. And so the co-op basically, in the first few years, they took like paid jobs. I shouldn't put it in quotation. They were paid jobs. It doesn't have to be in air quotes. But the thing that was kind of funny about it is those were their like commercial jobs. But their commercial jobs was like Radical America for SDS, or the Industrial Workers of the World, like Little Red Songbook. You know, they printed that, and then they got paid to do that, and then that's how they paid off their debts. But then they still had to pay the monthly rent. But I think that was also, so like basically if you were using the co-op, you kind of did have to do a little bit of work on these like collective projects that were paid in order to pay off the debt and pay the monthly rent. But then Freddie and Lorraine Perlman themselves, they didn't have a lot of money, but Detroit was a lot cheaper. I mean, every place was cheaper at that time. And Lorraine also played the violin professionally. So she had some gigs playing violin.
Well, I think we have a few more minutes if there's a couple more questions. Well, I guess I could just ask a sort of obvious, or I don't know if it's obvious, but I guess I'm curious, like in doing the research, and I mean, I was even just thinking about the last section that was talking about, you know, not publishing through recognized means, or like through universities or publishing houses. I guess I'm just wondering how it's influenced your approach to, you know, your practice outside of maybe this specific research, or yeah, how this research has influenced other parts of your work.
Yeah, like so the next kind of researchy thing, or that I want to kind of get into, is more thinking about like how graphic design, what is going on in graphic design on the left right now. So I've been actually doing like interviews with people who are either part of political movements or are designers who do a lot of work for kind of left movements, because I think the obvious thing, you know, is like you look at these and you're like, okay, they were printing pamphlets, but like what are graphic designers doing now? And does it even matter? Like, is there a role for graphic design in a lot of this kind of like political activity? But so I guess so one of the ways it influenced me is that like I was doing that research and I was kind of stressing, because I was like, wow, like between 1968 and 1972, they printed so much, you know, and I felt really like lazy. So I tried to, you know, so I feel like then I tried to kind of get more involved like locally in Detroit to kind of figure out what's going on the left here, you know, and media, like owning the means of production and kind of understanding the means of communication are still super critical for left movements. And I think we see that, you know, but it's like, as it's happening, it's hard for us to kind of see the forest for the trees, you know, like we can see that the right has a handle on media for sure. And we're like trying to figure out how to harness that on the left is a bit, I mean, people also have it on the left, but I think trying to figure out like what role do we play as designers, or what, you know, designers are sometimes called like communication designers. It's like, what role do we play through communications? That's kind of stuff I've been trying to think about, because at that time, the pamphlets, like those things were the things that were circulating and were kind of activating people. I mean, and then the other thing, this is just like rambling, but the other thing is that they were printing pamphlets and books, but there were other printers in Detroit, like Black Star Publishing, which was part of this group called the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, that was doing a lot of printing too, but they were printing like flyers and leaflets. So like flyers for like getting out to an action or like shutting down a factory or whatever. So that's a different kind of, like the things Freddie Perlman and, you know, what they were printing was a little more like on a slower pace of like, it wasn't for the next action, it was more like, you know, ideas driven. So I don't know, that's not really, I don't know, that's just ramblings about that stuff. But I feel like I'm trying to think now about, you know, that's kind of a question I have now is like, what's going on? And also thinking about graphic design labor is another thing I'm trying to think about is like, do graphic designers like as a is there a graphic design class, and do we have like power as a group, as a class, you know, in the way that so other trades do and stuff like that.
Totally, thank you. Well, I guess if there's any, are there any other questions? I think we maybe have time for one more question. I know it's just at 5 o'clock now.
I'm curious, did Freddie and Lorraine ever experiment with any mediums outside of print, with audio, video, anything like that?
Yeah, like, so not in terms of media, but Freddie did write a couple plays and like did some plays. And he also like, I mean, his later things, like he wrote like novels later. So he kind of, there's these things in these archives where he was like, he also got really interested in like the indigenous history in the land that's now Michigan. Like, so he kind of like, there in the archives, there's these crazy press sheets that like, I mean, not the press sheets are crazy, but like he has these press sheets that are like these large poster sized papers. And then on the back, he did these like crazy timelines of the area. Like he became really interested in the like Anishinaabe and Ojibwe people that lived here and like trying to trace that history. So this was like later in his life. And he wrote a book called The Strait, kind of about that. So like that's the other reason like I kind of am also interested in Freddie Perlman, because his interests kind of just like would just change, you know, super into printing and then he got into that. And in the end, like he's kind of most known among like anarchists as an anarcho-primitivist, like it's kind of like back to the land, like, you know, throw all your machines into the forest kind of person. So yeah.
Cool,
yeah,
thanks.
all the radical lines trace back to like indigenous. Okay. I mean, I think the thing is he took some trip to Alaska and was like, what? And then but yeah, no, I agree. I think it's also like interesting to me now living in Michigan to see that that's the route he kind of ended up taking, is that like,
Well, I think, yeah, we're just at time now. So yeah, I just want to thank you again, Danielle, for sharing with us today, and also to all the students for sharing, and Zara and Christian, and the rest of Hardworking Goodlooking, and Amy for all their support this semester. So yeah, thank you so much, everybody. I also want to just mention that you can follow this website, Alt Knowledges, where we'll present the live stream in a few weeks. And yeah, just please, you know, thank you so much again. Please look out for those physical installations and live stream, and hope to see you early next year. Oh, and the students, if you can log back onto our other call at 5:30, that'd be great. Great. Thank you, everybody.
thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Amazing.